Dodie makes her way through the festive streets of Mountain View to the antique store she and her business partner Olivia have just purchased. Outside, Olivia is busy applying decals to the storefront, and Dodie excitedly holds up a newly purchased wreath she believes would fit perfectly on the door. They head inside, and Olivia mentions that Mr. Bright, Dodie's father, is still around. Dodie is surprised, certain that he had an early flight, but Olivia explains he had wanted a final look at the store before leaving. As if on cue, Mr. Bright emerges from the back of the store, making a few comments about its layout. Olivia thanks him again for helping them out with a startup loan for their business, and Mr. Bright reminds them they have to make it up. Dodie assures her father she'll make him proud, and he smiles, admitting that they'd miss her during the holidays. Dodie acknowledges it'll be her first Christmas away from home, and that she will indeed miss them. They share a brief hug before he leaves, and he jokingly reminds them not to let him down. Once again, Dodie assures him they won't. With her father gone, Dodie takes a look around the store, consulting Olivia on their next move. Olivia points out they have stock to unpack, and they take a look around. Their eyes fall on a vintage wardrobe, and they pause to admire it for a moment before getting down to business. But first off, Dodie heads outside to hang the wreath. Dodie sets out the ladder to hang the wreath, but struggles with the thought of climbing up it. Meanwhile, Ed walks past, groceries in hand, to his truck parked nearby, and offers to help. Dodie politely declines, insisting she could manage, but Ed comes over anyway. After an unsuccessful second attempt, Dodie finally accepts his help. Dodie worries it might be too high up the ladder for Ed, but he reassures her he's totally used to climbing, being a contractor. He takes the wreath from her, easily hanging it up, and Dodie thanks him. Taking a look at the store, Ed asks if it's a new business, and Dodie confirms it is, explaining that she co-owns it alongside her business partner Olivia. Ed and Dodie then introduce themselves to each other, and Ed asks what they sell. Dodie lists a few of their antiques and vintage items, and Ed reveals his disinterest in old things. Dodie, in earnest disbelief, starts listing out a few examples: big bands, classic films, Clark Gable, the Andrew sisters. Ed expresses disinterest in each one, mentioning a couple of things he does prefer. Neither can understand the other's preferences, but they laugh regardless. Ed mentions he needs to get home with his groceries before the ice cream melts. Dodie, amused, comments on how back home in Chicago that wouldn't be a problem given the snow. Curious, she asks why there isn't any snow in town, and Ed explains they haven't had snow for about 20 years now. Dodie is surprised, given the town's name, but Ed clarifies that it comes from the town's spectacular view of the mountain. He jokes that she could always take her complaint to the North Pole, and they end the conversation on a warm note. Dodie heads back inside, and Olivia teasingly asks who the man is. Dodie, with little interest, relays that his name is Ed, and he's a contractor. Olivia makes a point of noting how attractive he is, but Dodie remains indifferent. Instead, she picks up an antique, enthusiastically narrating a story she believes would suit its history. Charmed, Olivia remarks on how she always seems to have a story for everything. Dodie walks over to the vintage wardrobe and, eyeing it thoughtfully, suggests they use its drawers as a display. She reckons it might need some dusting first, and Olivia agrees, adding that she'd be heading out to file a copy of their business license in the meantime. Dodie gets right to dusting. She takes out one of the drawers, cleans it, and is about to put it back when she notices something in its space. She reaches in and pulls out a box. Inside are various items: a photo, a book of poetry, a Christmas pin, and other objects seeming to hold sentimental value. Later that evening, Dodie tells Olivia all about the box, convinced that every item inside must be a testament to an incredible romance. She grabs a letter from the box and reads aloud, "My dearest Ginger, may this be the first of a lifetime of holidays together. You have my heart always and forever, Carl." Dodie can't quite make out the blotched address but can see that it's in town. With dreamy eyes, she wonders who the couple were and how their story might have ended. Olivia, however, doesn't share Dodie's enthusiasm, struggling to see why it should matter to them. Dodie tries to make her see reason, insisting that if it were her box, she'd want it returned. Olivia agrees but argues that it wouldn't be possible, seeing as they had no way of contacting the owners. Dodie, however, believes if they do find them, it will go to prove her romantic movies were all right. Real, lasting love does exist. Now that's a hopeless romantic. Raising an eyebrow, Olivia asks Dodie if that's what she's looking for. Dodie affirms this, adding that it will happen when the time is right. Olivia remains skeptical, and Dodie assures her she'll find the couple, return the box, and prove her wrong. The next day, Dodie goes around town, searching for information about the couple. She encounters Mrs. Willoughby, Ed's mom, who she finds is a realtor. Dodie mentions she's looking for some information, and Mrs. Willoughby points her to a nearby house, stating that its owner claims to know everything about the town. Dodie heads over to the house Mrs. Willoughby had pointed out and calls out to its owner. To her surprise, she finds it's Ed, and questions if he's following her. Ed, taken aback, returns the question. Dodie clarifies she wasn't looking for him, and proceeds to ask if the house is his. Ed confirms it is, adding that he was currently remodeling it for sale. Pointing to the box in her hand, Ed asks how he could help. Dodie excitedly explains she's looking for a Carl and Ginger, but doesn't have any further details. She shows him the box, and Ed has a look. He notes the names and addresses on the letter, but asserts that no one with those names has lived on the street in the years. Curious, Ed asks why she's so interested in finding them anyway. Dodie asserts she needs to prove something to herself, and Ed looks amused. Back at the store, Dodie tells Olivia about her failure to find the couple. Olivia, however, is happy to inform Dodie that she solved the mystery. She explains that she'd gotten the number of the woman who had put the wardrobe up for sale. Olivia points over to the woman in the wardrobe, and Dodie goes to her with the box. Dodie asks the woman if the wardrobe had belonged to her, and she confirms she'd been the one to sell it. However, she takes a look inside the box and reveals the items inside aren't hers. Confused, Dodie asks if her name isn't Ginger, but the woman states it's Ellen. Ellen explains she'd gotten the wardrobe at a swap meet many years back, with no idea the box was ever inside. Apologizing for the disappointment, she leaves the box behind. Ed pulls up to the store, apologizing for acting like a jerk earlier. He offers to help Dodie find the box's owner, certain he recognizes where the photo inside was taken. Dodie wonders why he's so eager to help all of a sudden, and he explains he would be very useful in finding the couple, seeing as he knows the town more than she does. Dodie remains skeptical, asking if that was his only reason. Olivia, who'd been listening in, comes to join them, and Dodie introduces the two. Dodie relays Ed's offer to her, and Olivia seems pleased, looking expectantly for Dodie's reply. Dodie, however, says she needs to focus on getting the store ready for its grand opening. Olivia tries to argue, but with a firm look, Dodie reminds her how busy they'll be. With a defeated sigh, Olivia agrees, and Ed takes his leave. With Ed gone, Olivia turns to Dodie, asking what her problem is. She points out that he only wanted to help, and is also very attractive. Dodie, uninterested, replies that he's not her type, but Olivia doesn't believe this. Dodie then adds that it simply isn't the right time. Olivia advises her to be smart, pointing out that if she wants to return the box, she'll need someone who knows the town. Dodie briefly reconsiders and steps outside to meet with Ed. She asks if he truly knows where the photo was taken, and agrees to check it out with him. They settle on a date and time, and the plan is set. Dodie and Ed arrive at the photo spot the next day, noting it looks practically the same as in the photo. It's a spot where kids come to take photos with Santa. An older woman dressed as an elf approaches them, and her name tag reads Wilma. They explain they're searching for information about people in a photo taken there 45 years ago. Wilma shares that many kids have come and gone, and unfortunately, they don't keep any records. Disappointed, they thank Wilma and are about to leave when Ed notices something. He points out to Dodie that Wilma is posed exactly as the elf in their photo. Dodie calls out to Wilma and asks how long she's been working there. She hands Wilma the picture, and after a good look, Wilma realizes it's her in the photo. She adds that she does remember the couple, recounting how it had been her first day, and the woman made her feel at ease. Dodie asks if she remembers the woman's name, but Wilma can only recall them mentioning that if they ever got married, it would be on Christmas. She then asks Dodie and Ed if they would like a photo, and Dodie happily agrees. Dodie and Ed head to a cafe, where a friendly old waitress serves them. As they chat, Dodie learns it's been just Ed and his mom, his dad no longer in the picture. Ed mentions how great a team he and Dodie made, and Dodie, catching on, clarifies she's not looking into a relationship at the moment. Dodie and Olivia continue preparations for their grand opening, and Ed helps out. Curious, he asks about Dodie's fascination with antiques. Enthusiastically, Dodie explains that every item has its own story, using an old Victrola as an example. Ed, unimpressed, points out that it's much easier to listen to music on one's phone. Dodie expresses genuine shock over Ed's inability to see value in the past. Amused, Ed grabs the Christmas pin from the box, asking for its story, and Dodie excitedly weaves a tale. Ed, however, remains unconvinced, but admires her creativity regardless. They rummage through the box again, and Dodie pulls out a book of poetry. She begins reading, and to her surprise, Ed joins in. He grabs the book to take a closer look and realizes it's been overdue from the Mountain View Public Library for years. Dodie and Ed exchange a knowing glance, realizing that whoever owned the box must have taken out the book, and that could possibly hold a clue to finding them. Dodie and Ed arrive at the public library, but find no one at the front desk. They follow voices inside to find one of the librarians reading to a group of children. After examining the book, the librarian notes how terribly overdue it is. Dodie and Ed explain that they didn't check it out, but needed to know who did. Initially, the librarian is reluctant to divulge such information, but eventually agrees. He explains the records are likely down in the basement, but that he needs to finish reading to the kids. Dodie and Ed then offer to take over for him, while he helps them search. Dodie and Ed happily read to the children, and then the librarian returns. He complains about the files being just too many to sort through. Dodie then offers that she and Ed have a look instead, and he agrees. Ed and Dodie head down to the basement and begin sorting through heaps of files. They find a box of ledgers from the 70s and pull out the one from 74. They trace the borrowed book's date stamp to a matching entry in the ledger and discover it was checked out by a man named Carl, although the last name is unclear. Noting the address, they decide to follow the lead. Dodie and Ed arrive at the address but discover the property's gone. Spotting an elderly woman nearby, they approach her, explaining they were looking for an address they believe was once across the street. The woman informs them the city had torn it down for a park that ended up not being built, and Dodie mentions they're looking for a man named Carl. The woman immediately remembers Carl, stating that he had moved away years ago, maybe even left town. Dodie then asks about a woman named Ginger he was dating, and the woman recalls their romance, but little else. Disappointed, they leave. That evening, Dodie and Ed continue their search, with Ed confirming that Carl Baylor had likely moved, as there was no record of him in town. Dodie pulls out a movie ticket from the box, wondering its significance, and this sparks a conversation about old films. This leads Dodie to desire to watch a movie, and Ed suggests they do just that. Dodie and Ed sit eating popcorn as they watch the movie on Ed's tablet. Dodie notes how much Ed is enjoying the movie, and he admits to it with a smile. Their hands brush as they both reach for the popcorn, and they pause to share a meaningful look before continuing the film. How cliché. The next morning at the store, Ed is back to help. Olivia asks them how the search is going, and Dodie shares what they know. She pulls out a newsletter from the box that mentions a tree lighting ceremony, and Ed explains it's an annual event in town, happening tonight. Dodie then reckons that if it were a tradition for Ginger and Carl, they might attend the ceremony every year, so they decide to go. Dodie and Ed arrive at the ceremony, weaving through the festive crowd. Unsurprisingly, Ed spots his mom, knowing she would never miss the ceremony. He introduces her to Dodie, and Dodie recalls they'd met prior. They start up a conversation, but Mrs. Willoughby remembers she has to meet up with a client. She bids them goodbye, suggesting they grab lunch sometime. After the lighting ceremony, Dodie and Ed decide to bring back some festive spirit to the store by lighting their own Christmas tree. As they decorate, Ed shares that he travels so much he never has time to set up a real tree at Christmas, and just uses a pre-decorated plastic one instead. Dodie disapproves, saying that it doesn't feel like Christmas to her. With a serious look, Ed asks what would feel like Christmas, and Dodie straightens, gazing into Ed's eyes as she says, "Merry Christmas, Ed, and thank you so much for everything." Ed smiles, and Dodie smiles back. Ed walks over to the Victrola and puts on some music. He says it's nice, but Dodie tells him he doesn't have to pretend. Ed assures her he isn't and asks for a dance. Dodie hesitates, reminding him they still need to finish decorating the tree, but Ed pulls her in for the dance. Eventually, he tries to kiss her, and Dodie pulls away, uncomfortable. Ed immediately apologizes, questioning when she might be ready for a relationship, and Dodie gives her usual response, "When the time is right." Dodie asks if they're still friends, and Ed agrees, adding that friends could also dance, and they do just that. Dodie and Olivia open up the store the next morning. Surprised, Olivia asks Dodie if she'd heard the rain last night. Dodie, just as shocked, explains that what the town lacks in snow, they make up for in rain. Then, excitedly, Olivia reminds Dodie it's just a day to their opening, and Dodie is equally as excited. The mood shifts, however, when they notice the rain has gotten in, soaking some of the stock. Both are devastated, and Olivia turns to Dodie, asking if she knows a good contractor. Dodie then suggests they call Ed. Ed checks the damage, confident they can get everything fixed before the opening. He also figures it won't cost much if they do it themselves, and this comes as a relief to Dodie. Ed, Dodie, and Olivia get to work, tossing out ruined items and salvaging what they can. Ed patches the roof and spends the night mending the wall, as both women sleep. The next morning, they wake to find the wall looking good as new, and overjoyed, they call out to Ed. They hear honking from outside, and as Dodie steps out, she is met with a snowball from the back of Ed's truck. Ed, who had driven out to the mountains to get snow while they slept, invites Dodie to a snowball fight, and soon, they're both hurling snowballs at each other. After a while, Dodie, still laughing, asks Ed to stop, admitting she'd really needed the fun. They count how much time they have till opening, making sure they have everything ready. Dodie mentions she's still got to pick up cookies for the opening, but Ed insists they can't serve store-bought cookies at Christmas. He suggests he ask his mom permission to use her kitchen instead, and Dodie agrees. Dodie, Ed, Olivia, and Mrs. Willoughby get down to making the cookies, and as they decorate them, the room is filled with warmth and laughter. Dodie and Olivia have their grand opening later that evening, and Dodie tries to sell an antique but is unsuccessful. Disappointed, she notes that people are admiring their items, but not buying any, and Olivia agrees. Olivia then spots a man over at Ginger and Carl's box and alerts Dodie, who rushes over to him. She politely explains the items weren't for sale, but the man, a collector, insists he's only interested in that one item, a key. Dodie explains they'd accidentally left it out and didn't even know what it opened, but the man easily identifies it as a post office key. After closing, Dodie and Olivia meet to calculate their sales for the day and are disappointed by the results. They brainstorm ways to boost sales, and Olivia comes up with creating a new website. Dodie, on the other hand, believes they could try marketing the stories behind the items, rather than the items themselves, certain that would capture customers' interest. The next morning, Dodie and Ed head out to the post office and inquire about the key at the front desk. The clerk smiles, recognizing the mysterious key, and explains how the box it opens never receives any mail, but is still paid for. She asks if they would like to check it out, and Dodie and Ed eagerly agree. Dodie opens the post office box to find a ring and a note. Dodie is overjoyed, content with the couple's happy ending, but Ed gently breaks it to her. If the note and ring are still there, it means Ginger and Carl never got married. The realization hits Dodie, and her excitement fades. She wonders why Ginger never picked up the ring and note, but can only speculate. Ed watches quietly, urging her to put the items back. Looking defeated, Dodie does just that. They return to the front desk, where the clerk confirms the box belongs to a Carl Baylor. Dodie asks for an address, but the woman finds that suspicious. Ed tries to lie, claiming Carl is his uncle, but the clerk isn't buying it. He then pulls her aside, inquiring about the cost of their box rentals, and Dodie uses the opportunity to glance at the system, noting Carl's address. The clerk hands Ed a catalog, and with that, they leave the post office. Ed and Dodie sit at the cafe, and Dodie mentions Carl's address in Wheatland isn't that far. Ed tries to reason with Dodie, suggesting that finding Carl might not be such a good idea anymore. Dodie, however, insists on finishing what they started. She believes in a happy ending, but Ed disagrees, suggesting she might only get hurt. Dodie is offended, upset by Ed's lack of support, and questions if his pessimism is really about them. Ed points out that couldn't possibly be, as she'd already made it clear she didn't want a them. Dodie appears hurt, certain that finding Carl and Ginger would prove she wasn't wrong to believe in love. Gently, Ed counters that she might be wrong, and Dodie grabs her stuff to leave. The old waitress comes in to pour them coffee, just as Dodie storms off. She sits with Ed, assuring him things will be all right, and guarantees that he and Dodie are a good match. She adds that Dodie knows it too, but is only afraid to admit it. With that, she stands up to leave. Olivia makes the website and has it running in no time, and Dodie's new storytelling strategy brings in sales faster than expected. Despite the success, Dodie remains focused on finding Carl, and Olivia asks what she plans to do next. For a moment, Dodie starts to reconsider, wondering if Ed had been right to call this a vain pursuit, but after some time, her resolve strengthens. She knows she needs to find out what happened. Dodie arrives at Carl's address in Wheatland and is greeted by a property full of magical splendor. She makes her way over to the front door, ringing the bell, and is welcomed by a man dressed up as Santa. She explains she's looking for Carl Baylor, and the man takes off his costume, revealing he is Carl. He asks her in, and Dodie is surprised. Carl laughs, explaining he had just gotten off from work, and hadn't had time to change before she arrived. Carl asks Dodie if they've met, and Dodie introduces herself, explaining how she had come to find him. Carl is stunned by her story, but notes that Ginger wasn't really the name of the woman he used to date, narrating how the name had come about. Dodie hands him the post office key, and Carl is emotional, hadn't expected to see it ever again. Dodie then admits to opening the mailbox, and Carl immediately asks if the ring is still there. Dodie confirms this, and Carl explains he had given the key to his Ginger in hopes she might return. He explains that she had broken things off, and he had lost touch with her. Dodie then asks for permission to search for Ginger, and Carl writes down her real name, Maggie Preston, giving his approval. He invites Dodie to his charity dance later, and they embrace. The next day, business continues thriving, with Olivia excited over the sales. Dodie, however, is more focused on her online search for Maggie Preston. Just as Dodie is about to give up, she finally finds a match in town and is overjoyed, sharing the good news with Olivia. Dodie shows up at Ed's house unexpectedly. Considering they weren't on speaking terms, she admits she had overreacted the other day, but pleads with him to put that aside and join her. Proudly, she informs him she has some news, insisting he come along with her to learn more. Curious and excited, Ed agrees. Dodie takes Ed to the cafe, leaving him puzzled. He asks if Ginger might be the waitress, but Dodie tells him to be patient. When the waitress approaches, Ed expects Dodie to confront her, but she places an order instead. Ed's confusion grows, but Dodie encourages him to place an order as well. Once the waitress leaves, Ed demands an explanation, but before Dodie can begin, Ed's mother walks in. Ed is surprised to see her, and she joins them at their table. Dodie explains that she had invited Mrs. Willoughby to lunch, and Ed is even more confused. Once again, he asks for an explanation, and Dodie pulls out the box, handing it to Mrs. Willoughby. Mrs. Willoughby, Margaret, is stunned at the sight of the box, asking where they had found it. Dodie explains that it had belonged to Maggie Preston, and it dawns on Ed, Preston was his mother's maiden name. Margaret goes over every item in the box, recounting the memories, and Ed and Dodie watch on in silent joy. Margaret explains that these memories were from long before she'd met Ed's father. She shares how she'd been so determined to pursue an art career, she'd chosen it over Carl, always believing it had to be one or the other. By the time she'd realized her mistake, Carl was already long gone. With no other choice, she'd packed up the memories and moved on. Ed asks if that was when she'd met his father, and Margaret reveals she didn't want to make the same mistake twice. She'd married Ed's dad, but they never had that spark, which is why it eventually ended. However, she adds that she doesn't regret it, as it led to her having a wonderful son, and Ed smiles. Margaret continues going through the box, and comes across her old Christmas pin. She gets emotional at the sight of it, and with genuine gratitude, thanks Dodie for returning the box. Back at the store, Dodie recounts how touched Margaret had been at the sight of the items in the box, and how much she wishes she could do something to fix things between her and Carl. Dodie firmly believes that Margaret still loves Carl, and is determined to find a way to bring them back together. Olivia, who's been listening quietly, turns to Dodie, questioning if her intentions were really for Margaret, or if she was actually doing this for Ed. Dodie hesitates for a moment, but insists she's doing it for Carl and Ginger. Olivia lets it go, though clearly unconvinced. Ed and Margaret sit out on their front porch, sipping hot chocolate and reminiscing about the old days. Margaret praises the wonderful job he's done remodeling the porch, and Ed mentions he'll be finishing the inside next week. Margaret suggests he consider keeping the property and moving back into town, and Ed admits it has crossed his mind. He then reveals he's missed the town and everyone. A somber expression crosses his face, and his mother gets him to open up. He asks why he's only now hearing about her and Carl, adding that if he'd known, he could have helped. Margaret argues that he already had enough to deal with growing up, assuring him he'd helped all he could just by being her son, and Ed smiles warmly. Just then, Ed's phone rings. It's Dodie with a wonderful idea. She invites Margaret to the charity dance, and Ed immediately thinks it's a wonderful idea. After dropping the call, he relays the news to his mother, and she is absolutely delighted. The next day, Margaret stops by the antique store to find a dress for the dance. Dodie helps her pick out a red vintage one, and Margaret loves it. She wishes Dodie could come along, but Dodie explains it's her turn to lock up the store. Margaret then hints at wanting Dodie to be in Ed's life, and Olivia spills that Dodie keeps claiming the timing isn't right, earning her a glare. Margaret then offers Dodie some advice from her own experience. She tries to pay for the dress, but Dodie insists it's a gift from her. As she makes her way out, Margaret notes with a mischievous grin that red is Ed's favorite color. Olivia then holds up another red dress, teasing Dodie, and she playfully warns them both to stop. At the dance, Dodie and Carl prepare for Margaret's arrival, and soon enough, she and Ed show up. Margaret beams on seeing Dodie, who explains that Olivia offered to cover for her at the store. After a brief chat, Dodie calls over Carl, who's dressed as Santa, introducing him to Ed and Margaret. Carl compliments the pin on Margaret's dress, and she reveals it was a gift from someone special. Ed cues the music, and Margaret is instantly hit with nostalgia, recognizing it as the song that played at her first dance. Carl then asks her for a dance, calling her Ginger, and Margaret's eyes widen in shock. He takes off his Santa costume, revealing his true identity. Carl. Stunned but overjoyed, Margaret lets him lead her onto the dance floor, their eyes filled with happiness. Ed, watching his mother with Carl, admits he's never seen her so happy, and thanks Dodie for everything. He then takes her hand and leads her to the dance floor to join them, as all four share in the joyous moment. Olivia and Dodie total their sales for the season and are thrilled with the results, confident they've made enough to pay back Dodie's dad. They celebrate, and Olivia teases Dodie about her and Ed, and she admits that he's pretty terrific. As the clock chimes, marking Christmas, they hear caroling outside and step out to check it. Surprisingly, it's snowing, and Ed is among the carolers. Dodie, surprised, asks if he did all this for her, and Ed smiles, confessing he'd do anything for her. He hands her a present, a house key. Dodie smiles at the gesture, and Ed kisses her.